Hello, and welcome to the Sparta Group podcast. We aim to provide you with up-to-date interviews and debate with opinion leaders in the health, well-being, rehabilitation and mental health space, from our studio or from conferences.
Hello and welcome to our podcast. I'm Carl of Sparta Health, and today we'll be taking a look at behaviorism. So, to start off with, there are set ways to act and react in society. We just know how to do so without really thinking about it. We all know how to behave in different situations, and we understand when someone is behaving in a way that is considered inappropriate or wrong. In this podcast, we will discuss the theory behind behaviorism and everything you need to know about what behaviorism is and how it is something incorporated in all of our minds. So, let's begin with the big question: what is behaviorism? Behaviorism is the theory that all behavior can be explained in terms of conditioning, and that behavior is a psychological response to a certain stimulus. The theory states that all behaviors are learned by our interactions with the environment, and the theory is quite specific to behaviors that can be observed, as this makes it easier to study and notice any patterns. Now, behaviorism is the umbrella term, but there are two main branches in the theory. These types are methodological and radical. Methodological behaviorism is based on the standard idea of behaviorism, which is that behavior is caused purely from external stimuli. Radical behaviorism agrees with this, but also recognizes the impact the internal brain functions can have. Another major distinction between radical and methodological behaviorism is that the methodological way believes that when you are born, your mind is a completely blank slate, and that every single behavior that you learn from that point is learned from external stimulus. The radical way, however, believes that we are born with some behaviors already trained in our minds, and that therefore our genes and biology have an impact on how we behave. To get an even better idea of what behaviorism is, I think it's best to look at some examples. Behaviorism is learning behaviors from your environment, so in this way it is used as a way of reinforcement. For example, it can be used for positive reinforcement. So, if you are trying to teach your dog, for instance, how to fetch, then when it returns the ball, you would praise it by giving it a treat or stroking it. This is how behaviorism can be adapted to animals, as when we have a pet, we need to reinforce the right behaviors and scold them for the wrong ones. Another example of positive reinforcement is in school, where if you do well, complete your work on time, or get a good mark, then you might be praised or given a gold star. This is also behaviorism, as you are being told that if you do this one particular thing, then you will be rewarded for it. Therefore, you are more likely to want to act that way again, as you know that it's the right thing to do. So every time you're in the same situation, you know how you should act, as you have had the correct way reinforced into you. The same principle applies with negative reinforcement. For example, when you were a child, if you did something wrong, then you would have most likely been told off or scolded. Maybe you had a time-out stare that you would be sent to if you were rude, or maybe you would be sent to your bedroom. This then reinforces your brain to know that if you behave in that way again, then bad things will happen, and so you know not to act in that way again. It is the same way with animals. If you are trying to toilet train your dog and they make a mess in the house, then you would tell them off or might spray some water in their face. This then lets them know that if they make a mess in the house again, they will be told off or have water sprayed at them, and so it deters them from behaving in that way again. When you think about it, the law is effectively a way of reinforcing the right behavior and telling you what is wrong. You know if you commit a certain crime, then you will have to pay a fine or may have to go to prison, and so you know not to behave in that way. If the law didn't exist, then how would people really know what was wrong and what was right? Another example is conditioning, and this is where a response becomes more frequent or predictable due to reinforcement. Behaviorism is a form of conditioning, and there are two types of conditioning that can relate to the theory. The two types are classical and operant. Classical conditioning is where a neutral response is paired with a naturally occurring stimulus in an attempt to result in a learnt behavior. So, for example, take a dog being given its food. The naturally occurring stimulus is that the smell of the food will cause the dog to salivate. However, you might want to train your dog to know when it's time to eat by blowing on a whistle. So, at the start of conditioning, blowing the whistle will get a neutral response from the dog as they've not learnt how to react to it yet. During conditioning, the dog will come to associate the blowing of the whistle with the food, so the resulting conditioned response will be for the dog to feel hungry when it hears the sound of the whistle. This can also be applied to trying to get a dog to come back to you when you blow a whistle. The whistle starts off being neutral to the dog, and then you condition the behaviour by blowing on it as they are walking over to you. They will then come to associate the whistle noise with returning to you and will know that this is the way to behave. Operant conditioning is teaching an individual a behaviour by use of positive and negative reinforcements, as described earlier. So when a positive and desirable result comes from performing a certain reaction, then that behaviour is more likely to happen again. If an undesirable result comes from a certain behaviour, then it is less likely to occur again. Let's talk about acquisition and extinction. Acquisition is when the behaviour you are trying to reinforce and teach someone is established and the process whereby that behaviour is strengthened. The bigger the stimulus, the more prominent it is, and when it is presented, all play a role in how quickly acquisition takes place and therefore how quickly a behaviour is established. Extinction is when a learnt behaviour is effectively unlearnt by the individual. So, for example, a child may have been taught not to leave their room in a mess, so they tidied it once after being reprimanded. However, because they have not been reprimanded enough or again, they then forget the behaviour and will revert to their old ways, so their room might quickly become messy again. If a response has been conditioned over a long period of time, then it'll reduce the likelihood of the behaviour becoming extinct. So, for example, if you have been teaching your dog to fetch for 2 months, they're less likely to forget that behaviour than if you had only been teaching them for 2 weeks. It's so important when trying to condition an individual to respond in a certain way to make sure that you are considering the timing of reinforcement. There are 2 different ways to time your reinforcement. First of all, continuous reinforcement, or secondly, partial reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement involves rewarding or scolding every single time a certain behaviour occurs. It's most often used when first trying to teach an individual a behaviour, but then after a while the schedule will also become more scattered and turn to partial reinforcement. Partial reinforcement involves rewarding or scolding a certain behaviour after a certain number of times, or after a certain period of time. It could be reinforcement that is set for a fixed time, or it could be unpredictable and happen whenever. Next we come to behaviorism in counselling. Behaviorism is so great because it can be applied to healthcare such as therapy and counselling. It can be used by a psychologist in order to understand where an individual's problems or mental health condition might have stemmed from. They might be able to understand why they are behaving the way they are from what the patient tells them about their past experiences and daily patterns. For example, if every time they mention an ex-partner they exhibit a certain type of behaviour, such as acting cold or suddenly going quiet, then the counsellor can get a good idea from this that their ex-partner might be the root of some of their issues. Behaviorism can then also be used as a method of treatment for the patient, so the counsellor would try and make the individual unlearn the undesired response or behaviour. For example, if a patient has come to them with anxiety issues and the counsellor has concluded from their behaviour that every time they talk about being in big groups they get nervous or sweaty, then they can use behaviorism to get them to relax in these situations. They might get the patient to lie back and relax and talk about the situations that stresses them, or maybe even present them with photos of the thing that gets them anxious to try and get them to unlearn the nervous feeling they get and instead train them to feel comfortable and relaxed when in those situations. So what are the advantages of behaviorism? Behaviorism can actually provide a lot of benefits in many different ways. It's great because it's allowed psychologists to better define behaviour and for them to understand why people and animals behave in the way they do. There is a law called the law of parsimony, and this states that the simpler a theory is and the fewer assumptions it makes, the better and more credible it is. This makes behaviorism great as it looks to find the simplest yet still scientific explanations that it can from studies. Another benefit of behaviorism is that it is based on scientific facts, which makes it more easily understood and also makes it a replicable behaviour that can be easily taught and learnt. Furthermore, it can actually be used in so many different areas of everyday life. It can be used in healthcare and therapy to help people who might struggle with certain mental health conditions. And it can also be used in education and childcare, and so really has a wide range of applications. What then are the limitations of behaviorism? While behaviorism provides so many great benefits, it does have limitations in the scope that it can reach. For example, whilst behaviour can be measured and explained through the theory, it cannot provide an explanation for emotions, why we are motivated or how we come to get expectations. Behaviorism is also criticised by the psychodynamic approach due to the fact that it does not take into account the role and contribution that the subconscious can have on behaviour. It also focuses on external influence on behaviour, which the psychodynamic approach believes makes it a limited theory. In a similar vein to the previous point, behaviorism is limited as it doesn't take into account biological or psychological processes, which many believe makes it flawed. So, there you go, everything you need to know about behaviorism. It's a key part of society that determines how every single person behaves. It's also the foundations of how we all know the ways in which we should and shouldn't respond in different situations. It's been applied to so many different industries and can actually bring lots of benefits to our lives. There is still more to be learnt about behaviour as a whole, but now you know how to use behaviorism and train that pet of yours not to make a mess in your kitchen. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed this podcast episode, make sure you subscribe for more content like today, and tune into our next episode to learn all about Bloom's taxonomy. I'll see you next time.
At Sparta Group, we are keen to hear your thoughts about the topics discussed today, so please tweet us at Sparta_health or visit our website for more information and support.